She didn't scream. She didn't fight back. She just sat there, her blouse soaked in hot coffee, her dignity smoldering in front of a room full of people who said nothing. She was quiet, older, and black. 3 things that made her invisible. In the eyes of a racist cop with too much power and not enough decency. But what he didn't know, what he never imagined, was who this woman really was. And by the next day, the badge on his chest would be gone. All because she chose to say nothing and let the truth speak louder than rage. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. When the hot coffee hit her lap, she just looked down at the stain spreading across her beige skirt. The cafe fell into stunned silence. All eyes shifted to the uniformed officer who had just accidentally spilled a full cup of coffee on an older black woman sitting alone, reading a book by the window. The man stood tall, with a smug half-smile, his badge glinting in the morning sunlight. She didn't even look up at him. She just folded the edge of her napkin, wiped at her skirt, and softly said, "You've made a mistake." He laughed. "Yeah, I guess I did." What Officer Ray Thatcher didn't know in that moment, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that the woman he'd just tried to humiliate was far more powerful than she looked. Not in terms of politics or money. No, her power came from who she had raised, how she had endured, and what would happen next. Her name was Mrs. Viola West, 71 years old. Retired public school teacher, widow, quiet, elegant, and known in the community as the woman who always gave, but never asked for anything back. Her life had been built on grace and quiet resistance. And most importantly, she was the mother of someone Officer Thatcher had reason to fear, though he didn't yet know it. Let's go back. Just 24 hours before the incident, Officer Thatcher was laughing over breakfast with his partner, bragging about how he handled rowdy types on his beat. Always with force first, questions later. To him, everyone who didn't look like him was a potential threat. The department had received complaints about him before, but they never stuck. His union was strong. His record was padded. And most of all, he wore the smug armor of someone who thought he was untouchable. He'd had a minor altercation the day before with a young black teen who had simply jaywalked. No warning, just a shove and a citation. The boy's mother had come to the precinct, demanding to see the chief. She was escorted out. It had become routine. He believed he was invincible. That morning at the cafe, when he saw Viola West sitting quietly with her tea and paperback, he made a comment under his breath, "Taking up space for too long." She didn't respond. That bothered him. He stepped closer. Her silence was to him a form of defiance. "You deaf or just rude?" he asked, still no response. She simply turned a page. He picked up the cup of coffee from her table, and with a slight tilt of his wrist, one he would later claim was accidental, he poured it into her lap. The cafe gasped. Someone dropped a fork. Another person started recording on their phone. Still, Viola didn't move quickly or lash out. She just looked at the coffee, and then, calmly, she looked at him. "You've made a mistake," Thatcher barked a laugh. "Whatever, lady." By the time he left the cafe, he was already trending. The video hit Facebook within 10 minutes. By 20 minutes, it was on Twitter, Reddit, and Instagram. The hashtags exploded. Hashtag Coffee Cop, hashtag Protect Black Women, and hashtag Justice for Viola. But he still didn't know who she was. Not until he got called back to the station an hour later. His superior was pale, sweating, and holding his phone. "Do you know who that woman was?" he asked. Thatcher shrugged. "Just some old lady being difficult." "That old lady," the sergeant said, "is the mother of U.S. Attorney Malik West." Thatcher blinked. "Who?" "Malik West, the federal prosecutor for this district. The one who's been working on indicting officers for civil rights violations. The one you've been mouthing off about." Thatcher's stomach dropped. In less than 2 hours, The cafe video had made its way not just through local news, but into national headlines. Federal prosecutor's mother harassed by police officer in public cafe. The mayor issued a statement within 4 hours, calling for an immediate investigation. The police chief tried to get ahead of it, promising full transparency. But it was too late. The public had already seen the video. And they weren't just angry, they were done. Inside her modest home, Viola sat with her son that evening. He had flown back from DC within hours of seeing the video. He hadn't called the press. He hadn't posted a thing. He simply sat across from her, holding her hand. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," Malik said quietly. "You were," she replied. "In every choice you've made, in everything you've become." They didn't plan revenge. They didn't need to. The system, this time, had eyes watching it from every angle, because this wasn't just about a cup of coffee. It was about what that coffee represented. The centuries of dismissal, of humiliation, of men in uniforms thinking they could silence black dignity with a gesture. And this time, the silence fought back. The next morning, Officer Ray Thatcher sat alone in a small, windowless office at precinct headquarters. The walls were bare, except for a fading poster about community outreach, something he had never cared for, never believed in. He had been told to report immediately to Internal Affairs. His badge was on the desk in front of him, along with his service weapon, both confiscated, pending investigation. For the first time in his 15-year career, Ray felt the weight of something he had never experienced before: accountability. But he still didn't fully understand the storm he had stepped into. Outside the precinct, the media vans were parked in rows. Protesters had begun to gather, holding up signs that read, "Silence does not equal weakness," "Justice for Mrs. West," and "Unfit to serve." Young activists live-streamed the event while others chanted. A group of elderly black women, dressed in Sunday hats and gloves, stood quietly holding hands in front of the steps. No one needed to say a word. Their presence was power enough. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Malik West was already coordinating with civil rights attorneys and federal oversight committees. He was careful, not because he didn't feel fury, but because his mother had raised him with restraint and purpose. Every step he took had to be precise, legal, and permanent. His goal wasn't just to punish one man. It was to send a message that these systems of silent abuse could no longer hide in plain sight. Back at the precinct, Ray finally pulled out his phone. His inbox was flooded with threats, insults, and national headlines. But what made his hands shake wasn't the public backlash. It was the video message that had just been uploaded by Malik West himself, not to threaten, not to call for violence, but to speak directly to the people. The video began with a photo of Viola West smiling in her garden, her wide-brimmed straw hat tilted slightly to the side. Malik's voice came next. "The woman in this photo is my mother. She has never asked for fame or recognition. She taught in public schools for over 40 years. She helped kids who were abandoned by the system. Some of them who wore the same uniforms as the officer who humiliated her yesterday. She's the reason I became a prosecutor. She's the reason I believe in justice. And now, justice must answer her silence." Within 24 hours, the video had over 10 million views. By noon, city officials were in emergency meetings. The police chief issued a public apology, saying the department was sickened and ashamed. That same afternoon, Officer Ray Thatcher was placed on unpaid suspension. But the public wasn't satisfied, because this wasn't just about his behavior. This was about the others who had seen it, who had laughed with him, who had said nothing when he bragged about putting people in their place. It was about the culture he belonged to, one that saw Viola West not as a human being, but as someone disposable. Meanwhile, Viola returned to the cafe. People stood as she entered. The owner personally escorted her to the same table by the window. He offered her tea on the house. She accepted politely, but said nothing. She brought the same book. She opened it. She turned a page. When a reporter asked her why she came back, she said softly, "Because dignity should never be pushed out of a room." The story shifted. From a moment of humiliation to a symbol of power. Not loud power, not angry, just steady, immovable dignity. In neighborhoods across the city, mothers began posting photos of themselves reading books in public spaces with the hashtag read like Viola. Schools began holding discussions on public harassment, on racial bias, on bystander silence. Even corporations joined in, pledging donations to racial justice initiatives in her name. But in the midst of this wave of support, another shoe dropped. And this time, it came from inside the department itself. An anonymous whistleblower sent a package to local news stations. It included dozens of internal memos, complaints, and video recordings showing Officer Thatcher's pattern of misconduct. Body cam footage that had mysteriously gone missing during previous investigations. Statements from civilians, many black, many poor, who had suffered under his authority but had never been believed. The headline exploded. Cop who attacked Viola West had years of abuse. Allegations. Why was nothing done? Now it wasn't just the community demanding action. It was the city council, the mayor's office, and even the Department of Justice. Investigations were opened. The police union, once protective, suddenly went silent. Internal affairs couldn't contain it anymore. The media, empowered by the receipts, ran daily specials about systemic failure and silent complicity. Ray Thatcher's name became a symbol, not just of racism, but of an entire culture of unchecked authority. By evening, a formal press conference was held in front of City Hall. Cameras rolled. Reporters jostled for space. Mayor Teresa Holt stepped up to the microphone and cleared her throat. Her voice was steady, serious, and sorrowful. "Yesterday, one of our own, someone trusted with a badge and a gun, chose to humiliate a woman who has given more to this city than many ever will. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a slip of the hand. This was abuse. And today, that officer has been terminated from his position with the police department, effective immediately." The crowd erupted in applause, but back at home, Viola didn't clap. She simply continued stirring her tea. When her son told her the news, she smiled gently. "He'll move on," she said. "But maybe now, someone else won't suffer like I did." Malik nodded. He understood. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice in the way most people wanted it, but it was a start. A moment when silence pushed back. When quiet dignity shouted louder than hate. News of Officer Thatcher's firing didn't just stay local. National outlets ran with it. CNN, MSNBC, and even Fox News hosted panel discussions with civil rights attorneys, police union reps, and community leaders. The debate wasn't just about him anymore. It had evolved into something larger. What happens when accountability finally catches up with abuse? What happens when a quiet woman refuses to play the victim, and the world decides to stand with her? But not everyone was happy. Ray Thatcher, now unemployed and disgraced, refused to go quietly. Hiding out at his brother's home in the suburbs, he gave an exclusive interview to a fringe media outlet sympathetic to law enforcement heroes. In it, he claimed the incident was blown out of proportion, that the video didn't show the full story, and that he had become a victim of cancel culture. "The media made her a saint," he sneered. "But you didn't see what I saw. You didn't hear how disrespectful she was, sitting there, like she was better than everyone." The backlash was immediate. His attempt to recast himself as the victim only further confirmed what many already believed, that he saw quiet confidence in a black woman as a threat, that he equated dignity with arrogance, and that his accident had never been an accident at all. The cafe, now known by many as Villa's Table, experienced an unexpected wave of attention. Customers flocked there from different parts of the state, some even flying into Take photos near the window where it happened. The owner, a first-generation Greek-American named Nico, posted a sign in the window. No racism, no silence, no exceptions. Viola never asked for any of it. In fact, she told her son that she found the attention overwhelming. "I'm just a woman who wanted a cup of tea," she said. But Malik reminded her, sometimes the world needs someone exactly like that to wake up. Meanwhile, deeper investigations into the police department uncovered more than anyone expected. What started as a single officer's firing snowballed into the exposure of a systemic problem. Over 40 internal complaints from citizens, most of them people of color, had been either ignored or mishandled. A handful of officers had quietly resigned within a week of Thatcher's termination, hoping to avoid scrutiny. But it was too late. Federal monitors arrived in the city by the end of the month. Policies were rewritten. Body cam access was expanded. Civilian review boards were strengthened. And it all started with one woman refusing to flinch. But for Viola West, the storm wasn't over. One morning, 2 weeks after the incident, she found an envelope tucked under her door. No return address. Inside was a single photo, her sitting at the cafe table, stained skirt visible, her face still and composed. Scrawled across it in red marker were the words, "Should have stayed quiet." She called her son. By the time Malik arrived, she was already pouring herself a cup of tea. No shaking hands. No signs of fear. "I am quiet," she said softly. "That's why they're scared." Malik insisted on getting the FBI involved. He knew threats like that didn't come from random internet trolls. They came from people with access. People inside the system who still believed they were untouchable. Viola reluctantly agreed. What neither of them expected was how deep the rabbit hole would go. Surveillance footage from nearby buildings revealed the envelope had been dropped off by someone wearing a badge, a junior officer still on active duty. When confronted, the young man cracked quickly. He wasn't acting alone. A small group of officers had formed a private group chat titled "Hold the Line." In it, they shared racist memes, mocked protesters, and talked openly about retaliating against the witch hunt. Public outrage reignited. Within days, more suspensions and terminations followed. The police chief, who had once stood by Officer Thatcher's record, resigned under pressure. A new interim chief was sworn in, and one of her first acts was to personally visit Viola at her home. Chief Elena Martinez stood at the threshold with no media entourage, no cameras, no speeches. Just a notepad, an open heart, and a promise. "I can't undo what happened to you, ma'am," she said. "But I can make sure it doesn't happen again." Viola offered her a seat and poured 2 cups of tea. From that meeting came the creation of the West Initiative, a citywide reform plan named in Viola's honor. It focused on community accountability, mandatory cultural competency training, and public forums between officers and the neighborhoods they served. But the real change wasn't in the policy, it was in the shift of perception. Across the country, other cities took note. The story of Viola West was held up as an example of how quiet resistance could uproot deeply entrenched power. Colleges invited her to speak. Churches honored her in Sunday services. Even the White House reached out, but Viola refused all public appearances. "I didn't speak to be heard," she said. "I endured because I had to." She only accepted one invitation, a small literacy event at an elementary school in the neighborhood where she used to teach. As she stood before a group of wide-eyed children, she said, "Don't let anyone make you believe that being quiet means you're weak. Your calm is a weapon. Your peace is power. One day, the world will try to make you roar. But remember, sometimes the whisper is what changes everything." That day, a young girl approached her and handed her a drawing. It showed Viola sitting by the window, book in hand, with the words, "You changed the world," written in crayon. Viola smiled and placed the drawing in her purse. where it remained for years to come. And Officer Thatcher? He faded into obscurity. After his failed media tour and the threats he tried to deny, he disappeared from public life. No police department would hire him. Lawsuits piled up. He filed for bankruptcy within a year. And in one final twist of irony, he moved out of state, only to find that even in his new town, people still recognized his face, but no one poured coffee on him. No one shouted in his face. They just looked at him, the way he used to look at others, like someone not worth the trouble. And in that quiet, in that isolation, he finally understood what it meant to be dismissed. As seasons shifted and the leaves in her front yard began to fall, Viola West resumed the life she had lived before the world knew her name. Her days were simple: morning walks, a pot of tea by 10, and hours lost in books that spanned centuries. Yet, the air around her had changed. Neighbors stopped to wave a little longer. Strangers approached her gently, often saying, "Thank you," with tears in their eyes. But to her, she had simply endured, not triumphed. Still, a ripple had begun. In precincts around the country, departments quietly reviewed their internal cultures. Federal agencies released new guidelines on civilian complaint procedures. A national training module, based loosely on the West Initiative, became mandatory in several major police academies. The story of the woman in the cafe had become a teaching tool, one used not to dramatize trauma, but to illustrate restraint, dignity, and the devastating power of passive cruelty. Meanwhile, Malik West continued his quiet war from inside the legal system. Armed with evidence that had emerged from the investigation into Officer Thatcher's circle, he successfully prosecuted 3 officers involved in the Hold the Line group chat for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to intimidate a federal witness, Viola West. The trial was short but intense. Screenshots from the group chat were presented. Testimonies from other officers, some who had been silently disgusted but too afraid to speak out, were heard. One officer broke down on the stand, confessing that he'd watched Thatcher's behavior for years and had said nothing. "I thought it wasn't my business," he said, tears rolling down his face. But it was. It always was. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict. The sentencing was broadcast live. Viola watched it from her living room, surrounded by former students who had gathered that day just to be near her. Some were now teachers themselves. One was a firefighter. Another, a small business owner. All of them carried the same sense of calm she had once instilled in them as children. As the judge pronounced the sentences, ranging from 2 to 6 years in federal prison, Viola simply nodded and said, "May they find the silence they tried to silence." But behind the landmark trials and sweeping reforms, a more personal story was still unfolding, one between a mother and son. For years, Malik had carried the weight of his work as if it were armor. As a federal prosecutor, he'd grown used to emotionless logic, airtight arguments, and unflinching presentation. But the incident with his mother had broken something loose, a part of himself he hadn't touched in years. He began to ask himself deeper questions. Who was he when he took off the suit? What had he missed in all those years chasing justice from behind a desk? One evening, as autumn deepened and the first hints of winter chill touched the air, Malik sat across from Viola after dinner and asked a question that stunned her. "Would it be okay," he said, "if I took a step back for a while, just to be present, to breathe, to listen?" Viola looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. "I raised you to fight," she said, "but I also raised you to rest. You've done enough, for now." Malik took a sabbatical. He rented a small cabin 2 hours outside the city, near the woods he used to visit as a child with his late father. There, he read books he hadn't touched in years, fiction, poetry, even a bit of philosophy. He took long walks without a phone. He cooked, he healed. And each weekend, Viola would visit him with a basket of food and a new book recommendation. They spoke more deeply than they ever had before, not about work, not about politics, but about life, about choices, about pain, about joy. Malik admitted that for most of his adult life, he had lived in fear, not for himself, but for his mother. That every time he saw the news, he wondered if she would be next. Viola, gently but firmly, told him to let go of that fear. You cannot carry a war inside you, she said, and expect to have room for peace. In that cabin, with snow beginning to blanket the trees outside, Malik wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. It wasn't about law. It wasn't about policy. It was a letter to his mother, titled "The Quiet That Changed Everything." In it, he wrote, "She didn't raise her voice. She didn't file a lawsuit. She didn't demand vengeance. She just sat in her pain and allowed the world to witness it. And in doing so, she did what no law ever could. She made us feel again." The op-ed went viral, not because it was flashy or sensational, but because it reminded people of what often gets lost in noise: humanity. It became required reading in journalism ethics classes, diversity training, and even high school English classes. Viola never read the comment section, but her mailbox began to overflow, letters from strangers across the world thanking her for showing them how to stand tall without ever having to raise a fist. Meanwhile, the cafe where it all began had transformed into a quiet landmark. The table by the window was preserved as it was that day. Same chair, same copy of the book Viola had been reading, now encased in glass. A small plaque read, "Here sat Viola West. She did not fight. She endured, and because she endured, the world changed." But Viola herself never treated it like a monument. She still visited the cafe once a week, choosing a different table each time. To her, that table was not sacred. Her strength had never lived in a chair, it had always lived within her. And so life returned, not to what it had been, but to something better. Not louder, not grander, just more awake. One afternoon, as Viola sat reading quietly, a young officer in full uniform entered the cafe. He walked straight to her and asked, softly, "May I sit with you?" She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. They sat in silence for nearly 5 minutes before he finally said, "I joined the force because I thought I could help people. After your story, I realized I needed to listen first." Viola closed her book and smiled. "That," she said, "is how real protection begins." Winter passed quietly. Snow gave way to soft rains, and in the first bloom of spring, something unexpected arrived in Viola West's mailbox. A letter, handwritten, addressed to her in careful block letters. The return address had no name, but Viola recognized the handwriting the moment she saw it. It was shaky, unsure, like a man trying to steady his hand while still wrestling with the weight of guilt. It was from Ray Thatcher. She didn't open it immediately. She let it sit on the corner of her kitchen table for 2 days, untouched. She wasn't afraid of what it would say. No, she had already faced the worst of him and come out stronger. But she needed time to decide whether his words were even worth her attention. Finally, on a quiet Sunday morning, with the kettle steaming and the curtains pulled back to let in the light, she opened the envelope. The letter was short, messy, sincere. That part she would decide later. "Mrs. West, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if it matters. But I need to say it anyway. What I did to you, the way I treated you, wasn't just wrong. It was cruel. I've spent months trying to find a way to justify it in my head. But there is none. You didn't do anything. You just sat there, and I hated that you weren't afraid. I hated that you didn't flinch. I think part of me hated that you reminded me of everything I never had the strength to become. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. But I am sorry. Truly." Ray Viola folded the letter neatly and placed it in her drawer, beside the drawing from the little girl at the school. She didn't respond. She didn't tear it up either. Some apologies were not meant to be answered. They were meant to echo inside the person who gave them. For the city, life was beginning to shape itself into something different. The West Initiative wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Police recruitment numbers had dropped temporarily, but the quality of new applicants had improved dramatically. People who once feared the system were now working to change it from within. Community liaisons were embedded in every precinct. Officers were required to do quarterly ride-alongs with civilians, not for policing, but for understanding. Churches, community centers, and local businesses were involved in monthly forums with law enforcement. And through it all, Viola stayed the same. She still rose before the sun. She still sipped her tea at exactly 10 in the morning. She still walked to the library every Tuesday. But people around her walked differently now, with a little more purpose, with a little more reverence. At a city event later that spring, Viola was quietly honored with the Civic Integrity Award, the highest recognition for civilian impact on government reform. She didn't give a long speech. She simply stood, accepted the small glass trophy, and said, "You don't need to raise your voice to raise a standard. You just need to remain standing when someone tries to knock you down." The crowd rose to their feet. Malik stood in the front row, tears in his eyes. Not because of pride, but because he finally understood something about his mother that he had never truly grasped before. She had spent her entire life standing tall for others, even when the world had tried to shrink her. That night over dinner, Malik asked her the one question he had never dared to ask. "Did you ever think about fighting back that day? About yelling, pushing him, doing something?" Viola paused, chewing slowly before answering. "I did," she said. "But then I realized, if I screamed, I'd become what he expected. And I refused to be defined by someone else's fear of me." That line stuck with Malik. It echoed in his head for days. So much so that he began drafting a book, part memoir, part social commentary. He titled it, "Defined by Dignity, the Woman Who Changed the System Without Raising Her Voice." It was published within the year and instantly became a bestseller. Viola refused to do any interviews or publicity. She hadn't asked to be known. But what moved her most was a letter she received from a woman in Alabama who had read the book. "I never thought someone like me could make a difference. But after reading about you, I sat in the front of the bus today for the first time in 40 years. And when the driver told me to move, I said, 'No,' quietly, just like you." Viola wrote back. "Thank you for taking your seat. It makes room for all of us." Across the country, the story of Viola West became a quiet fire, slow, steady, impossible to put out. She wasn't a celebrity. She didn't appear on late-night shows or in viral videos. But her influence wove into the culture, into classrooms, into policy rooms and precincts and living rooms. One day, a young black woman, newly appointed as the youngest council member in city history, asked if she could visit Viola. They sat in the garden, tea between them, as birds chirped overhead. "I ran for office because of you," she said. "Not to be famous, but because I realized I didn't need to be loud to be powerful." Viola smiled gently. "Power isn't about volume," she said. "It's about consistency." The young woman asked, "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened? That you had just gotten your tea in peace that day?" Viola looked up at the sky. The wind tugged gently at her scarf. She thought for a moment. "I wish," she said softly, "he had never poured the coffee. But I'm grateful I didn't let it burn me." The years passed quietly, the way Viola West had always preferred them. The flowers in her garden came and went with the seasons. Her knees ached more than they used to. Her walks grew shorter, but her presence never did. In her neighborhood, she became more than just a name. She became a symbol. Not of pain, but of perseverance. Local children began calling her Mama Vay. Not because she asked them to, but because she listened. She welcomed them into her yard when they had nowhere else to go. She handed out books more often than candy and told stories that made them sit straighter and think deeper. She was the same woman who had once taught in crowded classrooms with broken heaters and outdated textbooks, and somehow made every child feel seen. Malik visited often. His book had sparked national conversations about reform and respect, and he had returned to public service with new clarity. But he no longer saw justice as something that lived in courtrooms or legal briefs. He had learned from her that real justice often began in the quietest places, in listening, in restraint, in stillness. It was how his mother had survived, and now how he hoped the country might heal. One spring morning, a crew from a documentary team arrived at Viola's home. They had reached out several times over the years, hoping to capture her story on film. She always declined. But this time, she said yes, under one condition. No lights, no staged questions, no makeup. Just conversation. They filmed her at the cafe table by the window. She was older now, but no less composed. She spoke in full thoughts, never rushing, never performing. She told them about the moment the coffee hit her skirt, about the heat, about the silence in the room, but mostly about the decision, the split-second choice to remain still. I've seen what happens when we react the way they expect. US too, she said, and I've seen what happens when we don't. The documentary aired months later under the title, The Stillness That Sparked a Movement. It received critical acclaim, but more importantly, it sparked change. Schools began using it as teaching material. Officers watched it during sensitivity training. Churches discussed it in sermons. Parents played it for their children. Not for entertainment, but for guidance. Viola never watched it herself. She didn't need to. She had lived it. But one day, her son brought her a box filled with letters from viewers across the globe. Some were handwritten, others printed from email. Many came from people who looked nothing like her, lived nowhere near her, and yet felt connected through what she had endured. One letter came from a retired police officer in Minnesota. I watched you sit still, and it made me remember every time I failed to speak up. I'm sorry. I've decided to mentor young officers now, to teach them not how to dominate, but how to serve. Another came from a teenage girl in London. I have anxiety, and I always thought I was weak because I was quiet. You made me realize silence can be powerful too. Viola read each letter with care, then placed them in a small cedar box by her nightstand. I'm not famous, she said to Malik one afternoon. I'm just visible now. To that, Malik smiled. You've always been visible to the right people. The world's just catching up. On her 75th birthday, a bronze statue was unveiled in front of the city courthouse, not because she asked for it, but because the people demanded it. The sculpture captured her sitting calmly, hands folded over her lap, gaze lifted slightly forward. Next to it, etched into a black stone plaque, were the same words she had once spoken at her awards ceremony. You don't need to raise your voice to raise a standard. But Viola didn't attend the ceremony. Instead, she sat in the cafe at a different table, sipping her tea. She watched the coverage from a small TV above the counter, smiling softly as a crowd gathered around her statue in the city square. Nico, the cafe owner, poured her another cup without asking. You did more than change things, he said. You reminded us how. She looked up, her eyes kind but firm. All I did, she said, was stay seated. That night, as dusk settled and the streets grew quiet, Viola walked home slowly. She paused at the gate, looking up at the stars. They blinked above her, silent and unwavering, just like her. She breathed in deeply, the air cool and still, and stepped inside. Inside her home, everything remained as it always had. No grand trophies, no red carpets, no awards cluttering the shelves. Just books, and peace, and dignity. Weeks later, News broke that the U.S. Attorney General's office would be launching a national oversight initiative, modeled after the reforms pioneered in Viola City. It was named the West Standard, a federal benchmark for accountability and citizen rights. When asked about it during a rare interview, Malik simply said, "My mother never asked for a legacy. She lived her truth quietly. And somehow that truth has become the foundation for others to stand on." In the end, Ray Thatcher became nothing more than a footnote in a much larger story, a faded symbol of a dying system. No statue was made. For him, no one remembered the badge number. He tried once to write a book of his own, but no publisher touched it. The world had turned, because stories don't belong to those who hurt. They belong to those who endured. And Viola West? She lived the rest of her days in peace. She saw her garden bloom each spring. She attended the weddings of her former students. She held great-grandchildren on her lap. And every so often, someone would stop her on the sidewalk, hold her hand, and whisper, "Thank you." To which she always replied, "Thank you for listening." And when her time finally came, years later, her obituary was just 2 lines, the way she wanted it: Viola West, teacher, unshaken. Because that was all that ever needed to be said.